Graviton Lance has always been a pretty solid weapon that got a lot better with the tuning pass that it received about 9 months ago, but for the past 5 months, since the launch of Season of the Wish, due to the seasonal artifact selections, I don't think Void has been front and center in most people's minds. And while that's not necessarily going to change until the launch of Final Shape, the Onslaught game mode has been a fantastic place to let Graviton Lance stretch its legs. The ad-heavy nature of the activity really lets it thrive and excel. And even though I have no reason to question its effectiveness, I like data, I like numbers, and I like to know exactly what I'm getting out of a weapon. Which is why we're here. Graviton Lance is a Void exotic scout rifle firing at 300 rounds per minute by way of a 2-round burst with 30 rounds in the magazine. The weapon stats as a whole are pretty darn good. The catalyst boosted range and the stability are both fantastic, reload speed and aim assist are decent, good airborne effectiveness, a perfectly fine recoil direction of 85, with lower marks and handling, but all in all, it's not that bad. The weapon's intrinsic trait is Black Hole. The fluff-free gist of it is the second round of the burst carries more damage and recoil, and is not affected by damage falloff. The exotic perk for Graviton is Cosmology. Kills with this weapon cause enemies to detonate and spawn void projectiles that track targets. The exotic catalyst, once unlocked and applied, is giving the weapon a range boost, and now carries 2 additional perks with it, Vorpal Weapon and Turnabout. Heading into the PvE section now, starting out with a look at this weapon's functionality for those who may be unfamiliar or just need a refresher. We are firing a 2-round burst with very minimal spread between the 2 bullets, but the gun can get a little bit bouncy when sustaining fire at its max fire rate. The catalyst is providing Graviton Lance with Vorpal Weapon, and given the fact this is a primary, that'll up its damage by 20% versus bosses, mini-bosses, vehicles, champions, or constructs. With the Turnabout perk, when knocking off a combatant shield with Graviton, our Guardian will get a 30 HP overshield, which is a bit less than the standardized 45 hit point void overshield provided by a perk like Repulsor Brace, but it is pretty easy to proc with it not being kill activated. This does have a 10-second duration timer, which is not to be confused with a cooldown timer because it can be reprocced at any point. For the Cosmology function, on kill, enemies will explode dealing Void Blast damage. When I tested it in PvP, it was pretty tight, but I do think it is a bit more generous on the PvE side of the game. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe 3 meters max damage, 6 meters ultimate radius. But out of that explosion will spawn 2 void projectiles. Sometimes these things just seemingly bounce around, and other times they make a hard beeline for a target. A little inconsistent, but if one of these Void Seekers or the initial blast happens to down a secondary target, you're gonna get another Void explosion and 2 more Seekers spawning out. So you can get a nice domino effect going in ad-heavy encounters. Last thing to check up on, the weapon's base reload speed, which I do have clocked in at 1.8 seconds. With that, let's go snag some damage numbers. But my disclaimer first. PvE damage numbers are variable and will change depending on content scaling or enemy tier. I've been doing all of my recent testing in the Spire of the Watcher dungeon at the Aklos encounter to keep the results consistent and comparable from video to video. Versus our boss tier target, you can see the varying damage between the 2 rounds in the burst. 2,732 on the initial, with the second dealing 35% more damage at 3,688. So that's 6,426 if both land as crits, with 96,300 in a single magazine. The time to empty comes in at 5.63 seconds for a single mag damage per second of 17,266, which is okay. My socks are not exactly knocked off, but let's weigh that against a comparable legendary pulse, like Elsie's rifle, which I'll slap a boss spec on and give it the frenzy damage buff. That's bringing it up about 24% from base, but Graviton is still about 40,000 points better in terms of single mag damage, and while Elsie's does fire its 30 rounds a little bit quicker, being a 340 RPM pulse, it still comes up about 6k short in terms of single mag damage per second. And while boss tier enemy is neither weapon's preferred target, Graviton Lance does fare much better in this case. Looking at the damage versus more applicable enemies, Graviton Lance is seeing an 18% damage improvement when moving from boss to major, while Elsie's goes up 42%. But much of that discrepancy is due to Graviton Lance not receiving the Vorpal Weapon increase anymore. But going down to minor tier enemies, with exotic primaries intrinsically dealing 40% more damage to red bars, the major to minor damage nearly doubles for Graviton, while Elsie's only moves up about 41.5%. And we haven't even addressed the big selling point for Graviton, the Cosmology damage. Now, these might not be perfect because blast radius is a factor, and they were kind of a pain in the ass to collect because oftentimes the blast and the Void Seekers will just kill enemies without popping a damage value. But 15,678 was the biggest hit from the Void Blast that I was able to catch on an unshielded major tier Minotaur in this activity, with a Seeker hit scoring around 2,700. Versus miners though, that Void Blast was dealing a very healthy 26,526, with a direct contact from a Void Seeker coming in at 3,878. So with Graviton's respectable damage per burst, the high damage from the explosion, and the swarm of grape-flavored gumballs that spawn out as a result, it makes this an absolutely incredible general use ad clearing weapon. Bonus points if there are tightly grouped enemies by the bunches, like, you know, in Onslaught. In the standard power level variant, it is a complete massacre. Just a single well-placed burst can wipe out a whole mob of enemies in some cases. But even when playing at Legend tier difficulty, while you will have to expend more rounds to down your targets, once you get that blast chain rolling, it can make light work in clearing the waves. And keep in mind, the Vorpal weapon benefit isn't just for the big baddies at the end of activities. Mini-bosses, champions, vehicles, constructs, they'll all take 20% more damage. So it may be working for you more often than anticipated. And the Turnabout perk, while not exceptionally strong, still does provide a small bump to your overall survivability. There might be a niche case every now and then where a timely shield break could save your life, but just in general, anything that helps negate incoming damage is always going to be useful, especially when it's just a fringe benefit of an already strong weapon. A few things to watch out for though. As mentioned earlier, those Void Seekers can be a bit inconsistent. If you notice that they're not seeking, you're not doing anything wrong. Some of them just aren't all that smart. And then Cosmology seemingly does not proc against airborne targets. Against wizards it will, but I noticed against harpies, shanks, servitors, for whatever reason, no. And you could also add exploder units to that list as well. Lastly, the Cosmology effect can cause self-damage. It's usually not a ton, but it's definitely enough to advise against dancing around too close to enemies that you're firing into. Overall though, fantastic PvE weapon in general, especially in Onslaught. It has just been putting in a ton of work for me in that game mode. With that though, heading into the PvP section for a quick checkup on how Graviton's faring on that side of the game. Versus opposing Guardians, Graviton Lance is scoring 35 and 50 for the split burst crit damage. On body shots, we'll see 21 then 28, all rounded up from slightly lesser values. For the optimal time to kill, we're looking at 0.87 seconds with 5 crits in one body versus all resilience tiers. And it is inconsequential whether the higher damage or lower damage bullet lands as the body shot. For a pure body shot time to kill, we're looking at 1.63 seconds with 10 shots landed, here again applicable versus any resilience. For a suboptimal kill speed, you can go 2 crits and 6 bodies in 1.3 seconds versus Guardians running tier 8 resilience or less, 3 and 5 will be needed versus 9 or higher. For Graviton's physical range, the first round of the burst is going to see damage fall off past the 40 meter mark. The second round of the burst, however, will never see any damage drop. Regarding the Cosmology perk, with the blast that occurs on kill, it can score a maximum of 70 points of damage. But enemies do need to be tightly grouped to achieve that with no damage registered outside of 4 meters. For the 2 Void Seekers that spawn out of the blast, if they do lock onto and catch an enemy Guardian, they're dealing about 20 points of damage apiece. And when testing against supers, Graviton did fare quite well. Versus every roamer that I tested against, I was able to go 6 crits in 2 bodies and put them down in 1.3 seconds, with Mrs. Ironworker running tier 8 resilience in all cases. And that is thanks to the 60% damage increase that Vorpal weapon is providing in PvP. Plus, you can see the Turnabout perk working here when we knock off the Guardian's shield. Something to note though, Vorpal weapon will not proc when shooting into a well of radiance. So in this case, even with a full 20 round magazine, I was not able to knock Mrs. Ironworker down in the well. And just some quick thoughts on Graviton Lance. I always kinda did like this weapon in PvP, even back before the tuning pass when it was feeling pretty outdated. It's a solid mid to long range weapon, which is typically where I do like to keep myself. But it does have a 300 RPM fire rate, so it can fend off enemies at closer ranges in a pinch. Also, those Cosmology assisted multi-kills always have and still do put a smile on my face. And in 6s, they do seem to happen more often than I would anticipate. And with Vorpal weapon built into the catalyst, you do have a fighting chance against supers. If one's heading your way, instead of just going down swinging, land some shots and you might come out on top. The 2-round burst nature of the weapon though, with the exaggerated recoil on the second round, does kinda hurt the weapon a bit in long range engagements. The further you are away from an enemy, the higher the odds are of the second bullet straying off target. And with the gun getting a little bouncy on subsequent bursts, it can kind of put you behind the 8 ball if you are trying to square off with a scout rifle from distance. So while range is generally Graviton's friend, there is an upper limit to it in that respect. Overall though, I do think Graviton is a pretty handy gun, and it did feel like it was holding up for me pretty well in PvP. I wouldn't say it's the best weapon out there by any means, but for those willing to play into its strengths, I think it could be a pretty solid pick. But that's all I got for you in this one. Please remember to leave the video a like if you did enjoy it. Feel free to subscribe to the Ironworker Gaming channel if you'd like to catch more of my Destiny 2 content in the near future. And with that, have a great day, Guardians, and I'll catch you on the next one.